Hey, Leonard. Imagine a military commander just walking into his king's throne room and, demanding an army of 600,000 men.
Right.
Like, just to put that into perspective, we are talking about a localized force that is larger than the entire population of most ancient
Oh,
empires.
easily.
And they were mobilized for the sole purpose of just wiping a single rival off the map. That is the kind of staggering, just unimaginable scale we're dealing with today.
It really is.
So, welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to journey into, well, one of the most chaotic and intellectually explosive eras of human history, the Warring States period of ancient China.
It's a wild time.
It is. We are tracking the brutal rise in the state of Qin, the tragic collapse of this massive southern giant, the state of Chu, and we're going to look really closely at the tactical brilliance and the profound human trauma that just defined this centuries-long bloodbath.
Yeah, and it's a phenomenal era to synthesize because, well, the sheer volume of our sources, the archaeological records from tombs, the bamboo slips, the philosophical treatises, they all paint a picture of a society that completely tore itself down to the studs
Right.
and then just rebuilt itself as this industrialized engine for war. I mean, we're talking about a period from roughly 475 to 221 BC where survival meant basically throwing out every established rule of, human decency and governance.
Which is so fascinating because I was looking at the timeline of the preceding era, right? The spring and autumn period. And the thing that really stands out is this illusion of order.
Oh, definitely.
You had the Zhou King acting as this central, universally recognized authority, at least, on paper.
Right, on paper.
And when the various vassal states fought, it read almost like I don't know, like a deadly gentleman's club.
That's a good way to put it.
Like they fought in chariots. The aristocracy observed these highly ritualized codes of conduct on the battlefield. But then you hit the Warring States period, and that polite facade completely evaporates.
It just disappears. And, the evaporation of that facade, it's rooted in a total structural breakdown of legitimacy.
Okay.
Because for centuries, the regional lords respected the Zhou court because they needed that central religious and political validation.
Right. It's like a massive, once powerful corporation, right, where the regional branch managers, the vassal states, they suddenly realize the CEO, the Zhou King, has no actual power.
Exactly. They realize the center is totally bankrupt. They have no military leverage to enforce their will anymore. And so the absolute death knell for that old feudal order, like the moment the dam officially breaks, is the partition of Jin in 403 BC.
Which is wild. I spent some time with the records on the Jin state, and the thing that just blew my mind is that they weren't conquered by an invading army.
No, not at all.
They were this massive, dominant power that just cannibalized itself from the inside out. I mean, how does an entire superpower just collapse into infighting like that?
Well, it happens when the elite land-holding families within the state realize that they actually hold more tangible resources than the duke they supposedly serve.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so in Jin, you had these powerful ministerial clans waging what were essentially private wars against each other for decades,
Yeah.
just gobbling up smaller families, consolidating land.
Like a hostile takeover.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And eventually it boiled down to four major clans. And one of them, the Z clan, got really arrogant and tried to extort territory from the other three, the Zhao, the Wei, and the Han.
And those three basically decided they had enough, right? They banded together and completely exterminated the Z clan.
Oh, utterly destroyed them.
Yeah, the sources mention they actually diverted a river to flood the Z camp. And then, this is the craziest part, the leader of the Zhao clan supposedly lacquered the Z leader's skull and used it as a drinking cup.
Yeah, it's incredibly visceral.
It's just so brutal.
But, that skull cup is the perfect symbol for the death of chivalry. But the real tragedy is what happened next.
What do you mean?
Well, the Zhou King, the supposed moral arbiter of the whole realm, he officially legitimized this violent usurpation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he elevated the leaders of the Zhao, Wei, and Han families to the rank of Marquess. So by doing that, the central authority essentially broadcasted a new universal rule. Might makes right.
Right, like if you can violently take power, we will just recognize you.
Precisely. And from that exact moment, the entire geopolitical map just fractures. 7 dominant states emerge to fight this 200-year battle royale.
But the violence doesn't just change politically, right? The very mechanics of how human beings killed each other shifted. We go from these polite chariot battles to just a meat grinder of mass infantry.
Oh, yeah.
And I have to ask, we hear about chivalry falling and the scale exploding, but was this just because populations grew, or did the very psychology of how they viewed human life and warfare fundamentally break down?
Well, the technology absolutely drove the psychology. You have to remember, when warfare was constrained to chariots, it inherently limited the scale of the violence.
Because chariots are expensive.
Extremely expensive. They require massive wealth. You need to breed specific horses. You need specialized artisans to build the vehicles.
Right.
And you need aristocrats with years of specialized training to drive them and shoot from them simultaneously. It was a rich man's game, and it was played mostly on flat plains.
Okay, so it's a very elite thing.
Exactly. But the Warring States period sees the widespread adoption of iron and steel.
Right, because once you can cast iron, you can mass produce weapons. You don't need a bespoke bronze sword anymore. You can just churn out thousands of iron halberds and, well, more importantly, crossbows.
Yes. The crossbow democratized death.
Oh, man.
Because you don't need a decade of martial arts training to operate a crossbow. You just need a few weeks of drilling to learn how to draw the string, point it, and pull a trigger. Suddenly, the peasantry, the farmers who used to just watch the nobles fight, they become the most valuable military asset a state has. You can suddenly field an army of hundreds of thousands of commoners.
And to manage hundreds of thousands of farmers wielding crossbows, your government can't just be a loose collection of nobles anymore, right?
No, absolutely not.
We see these states undergo brutal bureaucratic overhauls just to manage the logistics of total war. Like the state of Qin, for example, was drafting 15-year-old boys.
Yeah, it was total mobilization.
Every male was either growing food for the army or standing in the infantry block.
Which forces the rise of a completely new philosophical framework. And this is where we see the emergence of legalism, particularly in Qin, under statesmen like Lord Chang.
Right.
Legalism was a radical departure from the moral traditions of the past. It basically operated on the assumption that human nature is inherently selfish and cowardly.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so their logic was, therefore, the only way to maintain order and forge a dominant military state is through a system of absolute terrifying punishments and incredibly strict laws.
It's essentially social engineering through terror. They instituted those mutual responsibility groups, right?
Yes, exactly.
Where if one person in your village squad deserted the army, your entire family would be executed or enslaved.
Yeah. Legalism stripped away any concept of individual virtue or tradition. You were rewarded solely for two things: agricultural output and cutting off enemy heads in battle.
That is just so bleak.
It is. It turned the state of Qin into this ultra-efficient, traumatized, and hyper-aggressive machine. But raw aggression wasn't enough to survive this era. The massive shift in scale demanded terrifying innovation on the battlefield.
And we see that innovation perfectly with the state of Zhao. In 307 BC, their ruler, King Wuling, essentially looks at the heavily armored, slow-moving infantry blocks of the Chinese Central Plains. And then he looks at the steppe nomads on his northern borders, and he makes this deeply controversial decision to force his troops to adopt, quote, nomadic dress and horse archery.
Oh, it was scandalous.
Really?
Oh, absolutely scandalous to the traditionalists in his court. The idea of wearing trousers instead of traditional flowing robes and riding directly on the back of a beast rather than standing properly in a chariot, it was viewed as barbaric.
Interesting.
But King Wuling understood a fundamental mechanism of warfare, which is mobility dictates the terms of engagement. Chariots get stuck in the mud. They can't turn quickly.
Right, they're clunky.
Yeah, but a horseback archer, they can harass an infantry block, retreat before the infantry can react, and strike from the flanks. Creating the first native Chinese cavalry unit gave Zhao this immense tactical advantage.
It really just proves that in the warring states, tradition was a luxury no one could afford. If a tactic worked, you adopted it. And that pragmatism fueled an entire industry of military intellectuals. We always hear about Sun Tzu and the art of war, but our sources highlight another fascinating figure, Master Wu, or Wu Qi, who wrote the Wuzi.
Yes. Wu Qi belongs to this really unique class of wandering scholars. You had hundreds of these highly educated strategists, philosophers, and diplomats just traveling from state to state.
Just pitching their idea.
Yeah, pitching to rulers who were absolutely desperate for any advantage. It was this high-stakes intellectual mercenary market.
A market where the venture capital was literally your own life. Like, if a king liked your strategy, you became a lord.
Right.
But if your advice led to a military disaster, or honestly, if you just offended the wrong court minister, they might literally saw you in half, or tie your limbs to 4 chariots and tear you apart.
Yeah, the pressure to produce actionable, brilliant insight was immense. And Wu Qi's insight in the Wuzi is profound because he doesn't just talk about troop formations. He introduces this whole concept of geographic determinism.
Oh, this is fascinating. Let's dig into this.
Yeah, he believed that you cannot understand an enemy's military character without understanding the physical terrain they live on, because the terrain dictates their psychology and their government.
It's like he's an expert sports scout, right? He wasn't just looking at the weapons, he was reading the cultural and geographical playbook of his opponents to exploit their psychological weaknesses.
Exactly that.
His scouting reports on the different states are incredible. He looks at Qin in the west, and he notes that they're surrounded by treacherous, rugged, mountainous terrain.
Right.
And because life there is hard and isolated, the government decrees are necessarily harsh, which ties right back to their legalist structure you mentioned earlier. Master Wu says the people of Qin are ferocious by nature. They scatter and engage in individual combat because rugged terrain breeds independent fighters.
And his prescribed mechanism to defeat them relies on exploiting that exact individualism. He advises baiting the Qin troops with small benefits.
Because they're greedy.
Exactly, because they are fiercely competitive and greedy for rewards. Remember, they only get promoted by taking heads.
Right.
So they will break formation and abandon their generals to chase the bait. And once they scatter, you isolate and destroy them.
Wow. And then he flips the map for the states of Han and Zhao. They sit in the flat, open Central Plains. Master Wu describes them as a gentle people, just completely exhausted by constant warfare.
Yeah, because their terrain is flat. They've been the crossroads for every invading army.
Right, so he says their troops are experienced, but they have zero regard for their generals, and they just won't fight to the bitter end.
So what's his advice?
His advice is just to overwhelm them, put them in certain peril, defend their counterattacks, and pursue them relentlessly so they never get a chance to rest. You just grind down their fragile morale.
Which brings us to his analysis of Chu, the massive state in the south. And this is crucial for our overarching narrative today. Chu's geography was expansive. Dense forests, massive river systems, endless swamps.
Just huge.
Yeah, and Wu Qi points out that because of this sheer vastness, the central government simply cannot effectively administer the territory.
Right, he actually calls the Chu people soft and weak. He says their formations might look well-ordered and massive on paper, but they lack the hard logistical infrastructure to maintain positions for long.
Because their supply lines are just too stretched across those swamps.
Exactly.
So his tactic for defeating Chu is actually a blueprint for what eventually happens. He says, quote, "Strike swiftly, unexpectedly, and retreat quickly before they can counterattack."
Wow.
He understood that if you force a giant, unwieldy army to constantly scramble and reorganize across bad terrain, you will exhaust them before a single sword is swung.
It is brilliant psychological warfare rooted entirely in reading the dirt and the rivers. But, this is geographic warfare wasn't always fought with troops.
No, it wasn't.
Sometimes they tried to weaponize the terrain itself through economics. I am honestly obsessed with the state of Han's canal scheme.
Of the Zhangguo Canal. It is a stunning example of asymmetrical warfare just gone completely wrong.
It really is. So the state of Han is sitting there in the flat plains, and they are absolutely terrified of the Qin war machine growing to their west.
Right.
Han knows they cannot win a military confrontation, so they devise this plot to bankrupt Qin through public works. They send a brilliant civil engineer named Zheng Guo to the Qin court.
Okay.
And his mission is to convince the Qin king that building a massive, hundreds of miles long irrigation canal is just this great idea.
And the underlying logic there is resource diversion. If Qin is pouring millions of man-hours, vast amounts of timber, and its entire treasury into digging dirt and redirecting rivers, they won't have the excess resources required to equip an army and invade Han.
It's literally sabotage by infrastructure.
Yeah, exactly.
And Qin actually falls for it. They commit to building the canal. But the paradox is it backfires on Han with catastrophic results.
Because it works.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it cost Qin a fortune to build, but Zheng Guo was actually a very good engineer. The canal worked perfectly. It irrigated the arid Guanzhong plain, turning it into the most productive agricultural breadbasket in all of China.
So by trying to drain Qin's treasury, Han accidentally handed them the ultimate geopolitical weapon, which is infinite grain.
Wow, yeah.
In an era where states are fielding armies of hundreds of thousands of men, the state that can feed its army the longest wins. The Zhengguo Canal secured Qin's economic supremacy.
And the brutal historical irony here is that Han, the state that orchestrated the whole scheme to save itself, was the very first of the 7 states to be conquered and assimilated by Qin.
It really backfired spectacularly. So if Han's trick accidentally gave Qin unlimited food and resources, the Qin court suddenly has the luxury of looking at the map and asking, okay, who do we crush next?
Right.
And this sparks one of the most consequential strategic debates in ancient history. You have the diplomat Zhang Yi going toe-to-toe with the general Sima Kuo in front of the king of Qin.
This debate perfectly encapsulates the shift from the old political world to the new pragmatic reality. Zhang Yi, the diplomat, he argues that Qin needs to attack east, march on the central state of Han, and seize the remnants of the Zhou royal court.
Right. He wants the prestige.
Exactly. He wants to capture the 9 tripod cauldrons, which were the physical symbols of the Zhou king's authority. Zhang Yi is operating on the principle of the mandate of heaven.
Which is a huge concept.
Yeah, and for our listeners who might just view that as a fancy title, it's a deeply ingrained cosmic mechanism. The idea was that heaven itself bestowed the right to rule on a virtuous leader and withdrew it from a corrupt one.
Yes.
So Zhang Yi believes that if Qin physically possesses the Zhou king and his religious artifacts, they will magically possess the cosmic legitimacy to rule all of China, and the other states will simply bow down.
Yeah, but he's chasing a ghost. He believes symbols still hold power.
Right.
General Sima Kuo, on the other hand, he understands that the old rules are entirely dead. Sima Kuo argues that seizing the Zhou king would actually be a disaster.
Ah, how so?
Well, it would instantly paint a massive target on Qin's back. It would unite all the other states against them in a holy war to, quote-unquote, rescue the emperor.
Ah, that makes sense.
And more importantly, Sima Kuo points out that legitimacy is entirely useless if you lack the overwhelming material strength to actually enforce it.
Okay, so Sima Kuo looks at the map and identifies the real existential threat, which is the giant state of Chu in the south.
Yes.
But instead of suggesting a direct attack on Shu, he proposes something that, on the surface, just sounds completely unhinged. He tells the king of Qin, we need to march our armies deep into the western mountains and conquer the peripheral barbarian region of Shu, which is modern-day Sichuan.
Right. And he famously justifies this with the maxim, conquering Shu is conquering Chu.
Wait, okay. Let's really break down the geography of that logic, because Chu is to the east and the south.
Right.
Shu is deep in the western mountains, entirely in the opposite direction.
Yes.
How does walking away from your primary enemy and marching into a mountain range help you defeat the largest army in the world?
I know, it sounds crazy, but it requires looking at a topographical map rather than just political borders.
Yeah.
Sima Kuo's genius was recognizing 2 hidden mechanisms within the geography of Shu. The first was resources. The Sichuan Basin was this massive, fertile depression surrounded by mountains. By conquering it, Qin would double its agricultural output.
Wow.
Yeah, adding a sack of breadbasket right alongside that Zhengguo Canal.
Okay, so it's an economic power-up. What is the tactical mechanism, though?
The Yangtze River. Shu controlled the upper, mountainous reaches of the Yangtze. And that massive river flows directly eastward out of the mountains, straight through the geographical heartland of the state of Chu. Sima Kuo realized he wasn't walking away from Chu. He was walking up the stairs to get above them.
Oh, that is devastating, because if you try to invade Chu over land, you are marching hundreds of thousands of men and all their food on foot across incredibly hostile flat terrain where Chu's massive armies can just intercept your supply lines.
Exactly. But if you control the upper Yangtze, you have a liquid highway. You load your troops, your armor, and your grain onto ships in Shu, and you just let gravity pull you downstream. You bypass their border defenses entirely and sail directly into their vulnerable heartland. It solved the logistical nightmare of ancient warfare in a single stroke.
It is literally the ultimate high ground.
Yes, it is.
So the king of Qin listens to Sima Kuo. In 316 BC, Qin invades and conquers Shu. And just like that, the logistical dagger is pointed squarely at the throat of Chu.
Yeah.
But Shu was not going to go quietly. We have to talk about the sheer scale of this southern giant.
Yeah, calling Chu a giant barely does it justice, honestly. It encompassed almost the entire southern half of the Chinese cultural sphere. It had absorbed dozens of smaller states over the centuries.
Wow.
Because of its vast territory, it possessed immense natural wealth, timber, copper, gold, And at its absolute peak, Chu could mobilize an army of over 1 million men. It was literally the only state that could match Qin man for man.
But Master Wu had called their vulnerability decades earlier. He said they were expansive, but poorly administered. And by the late 3rd century BC, when Qin is finalizing its wars of unification, the rot inside Chu is terminal.
Yeah, the corruption was systemic. Chu's government was essentially a bloated aristocracy.
Hmm.
Unlike Qin, which promoted officers based strictly on how many enemy heads they took, Chu's military and civil leadership was based purely on noble birth.
Oh, yikes.
Yeah. The central treasury was perpetually drained by the extravagant lifestyles of the royal family and thousands of useless courtiers.
So they had massive numbers, but the troops were poorly equipped, poorly motivated, and led by aristocrats who were, frankly, more interested in court poetry than logistics.
Exactly.
Still, when the king of Qin, Yingzheng, the man who will soon become the legendary first emperor,
Right.
when he decides it is finally time to pull the trigger and eradicate Chu, he doesn't take it lightly.
No, he convenes a war council. He looks at his top generals and asks the defining question, how many troops will it take to wipe Chu off the face of the earth?
And we get this incredible clash of egos that perfectly highlights the tension in the Qin military machine. You have Li Jin, this younger, aggressive, highly decorated general. He steps up and boldly claims, "Give me 200,000 men and I will conquer Chu."
Right, but then you have Wang Jian, the grizzled veteran supreme commander of the Qin forces. He shakes his head and tells the king, absolutely not. Chu is too vast. A force of 200,000 will be swallowed up in their territory. I will not march with a single man less than 600,000.
600,000 troops. I mean, the psychological weight of handing one general an army of that size is terrifying for a king. You are handing over the entire military apparatus of the state.
Oh, absolutely.
If Wang Jin decides to turn that army around and march on the Tin capital, the king is dead.
Exactly. So Ying Zheng, acting out of paranoia and, well, resource conservation, sides with the younger Li Jin. He gives him the 200,000 troops and sends himself.
And King Yingzheng learns a very painful lesson about underestimating cornered giants.
He really does.
Li Xin crosses into Chu territory and actually wins a few initial skirmishes. He thinks the Chu army is crumbling. But the Chu forces are commanded by Shang Yan, who is a genuinely brilliant and just desperate general.
Right, and Shang Yan doesn't engage in a pitched battle right away. He uses the vast geography of Chu to his advantage. The sources say Shang Yan secretly shadows Li Xin's advancing army for 3 days and 3 nights.
Oh, wow.
He waits until the Qin supply lines are stretched thin across the marshlands, until the Qin soldiers are just exhausted from marching in the humid southern heat.
And then Shang Yan springs a massive ambush. He completely envelops Li Xin's forces, shatters their command structure, and slaughters the Qin invaders. It is a catastrophic defeat.
Yeah, it's widely considered the single greatest military disaster Qin suffered during their entire century of unification wars.
You could almost feel the humiliation radiating off King Yingzheng when the survivors stagger back north. I mean, he has to physically travel to the estate of Wang Jian, who had supposedly retired in protest.
Right.
And he has to beg the veteran general to come back and fix the mess.
And Wang Jian says, I will do it, my king. But the price hasn't changed. 600,000 men. And Yingzheng relents. He hands over the massive army.
And the campaign that follows is just a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Wang Jian marches this leviathan of an army down to the Chu border to a place called Pingyu. He orders his men to build heavily fortified camps, and then he does absolutely nothing.
For an entire year.
Let's really think about the mechanics of that. You have 600,000 young, aggressive, hyper-violent Qin soldiers, men whose entire societal worth is based on killing enemies.
Right.
And Wang Jian strictly orders them to sit in the dirt and play games. He actually encourages them to hold rock-throwing contests and rest. The Chu army, led by Shang Yan, marches up to the Qin defenses, desperate to fight, and Wang Jian just refuses to open the gates.
It is the strategic deployment of boredom.
It's like the rope-a-dope.
Exactly. It's very similar to the rope-a-dope strategy Muhammad Ali used in boxing. You lean back against the ropes, you let your opponent punch themselves out, you let the adrenaline spike and then completely crash. Wang Jian knew that the Chu army was suffering from terrible logistics. They could not afford to keep hundreds of thousands of men deployed on the border indefinitely without the state going bankrupt.
And it works. After a year of screaming at a brick wall, the Chu troops are exhausted, their supplies are dwindling, and they assume Wang Jian is just too cowardly to fight. So Zhang Yan orders a general retreat to disband and resupply.
And the absolute millisecond the Chu army turns its back and drops its defensive posture, Wang Jin unleashes the Hound. He orders his rested, fully acclimated 600,000-man army into a full-scale, relentless pursuit.
They crash into the retreating Shu columns like a tidal wave. Shang Yan's army is completely overrun. Shang Yan is killed. The Qin forces sweep through the wetlands, shatter the remaining defenses, and in 223 BC, they capture the Chu capital. The king of Chu is taken prisoner. The southern giant is literally erased from the map.
It's incredible. But there is a vital hidden layer to Wang Jian's victory that we have to explore. While he was sitting in that camp for a year, executing this brilliant military stall tactic, he was simultaneously fighting a desperate political war against his own king.
Right. The sources note that while camped at Pingyu, Wang Jian was constantly sending messengers back to the Qin capital. But he wasn't asking for more troops or grain.
No.
He was aggressively demanding deeds to fertile land, beautiful mansions, and guarantees of wealth for his grandchildren. His own officers were actually embarrassed by how greedy he was acting.
Yeah, but they didn't understand the mechanism of survival under a tyrant.
Exactly.
Ying Zheng was profoundly paranoid. He had just handed Wang Jin 600,000 heavily armed men. If Ying Zheng suspected for a fraction of a second that Wang Jin was building loyalty with his troops to stage a coup, he would have had Wang Jin's entire extended family executed and replaced him as commander immediately.
So the greed is camouflage. By constantly demanding real estate and retirement packages, Wang Jin is intentionally sending a signal to the king. Look at me. I am just a shallow, materialistic old man. I have no grand political ambitions. I don't want your throne. I just want a nice garden.
It was a perfectly calculated performance of avarice. He had to manage the psychology of his paranoid CEO in order to keep his job long enough to finish the war.
That is just wild. The mental bandwidth required to orchestrate the destruction of a massive empire while actively gaslighting your own king so he doesn't murder you, it really encapsulates the insane pressure of the era.
It really does.
So Qin achieves its goal. They conquer Chu, the map is unified, but if history teaches us anything, conquering a piece of dirt and conquering the human beings who live on it are two entirely different mechanisms.
Oh, absolutely. And this brings us to the visceral reality of what it meant to be a conquered citizen in the ancient world. The collision between Qin and Chu wasn't just military, it was a violent cultural trauma. These were two diametrically opposed civilizations forced into a single cage.
We have to explore why Chu's culture was so distinct. If we apply Master Wu's geographic logic, it makes perfect sense. Chu developed in the dense, humid, swampy environment of the Yangtze River Basin. Navigating that kind of deep, mysterious, heavily forested terrain breeds a certain kind of society.
Right.
They were highly decentralized, deeply spiritual, and heavily influenced by local shamanism and early Taoism.
Yeah, they revered the natural world because it was so overwhelmingly present in their daily lives. Their art is filled with flowing, chaotic natural energy. Snakes intertwined with dragons, phoenixes, free-flowing clouds.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and they worship Zhurong, a mythical god of fire, which is why brilliant reds and blacks dominated their famous lacquerware. They were a society that valued aesthetic pleasure, poetry, and the mystical.
And then the Qin imperial administrators roll into town, Qin, which was forged in the harsh, arid, desperately poor plains of the north, a culture that worshipped only efficiency, agricultural quotas, and military discipline.
To the rigid legalist administrators of Qin, the vibrant spiritual culture of Chu was not just different, it was an active threat. It was viewed as decadent, superstitious nonsense that distracted the peasantry from their only two valid purposes, farming and fighting.
Right.
So the Qin regime aggressively attempted to strip away the Chu identity, imposing draconian laws that regulated every minutia of daily life.
And we actually have physical evidence of this friction, don't we? The excavated bamboo slips from a Qin administrator working in former Chu territory.
Yes, the Shuhidi bamboo slips. They are essentially the diaries and legal manuals of a Qin official trying to govern the South. And they reveal a populace that was deeply, deeply resistant.
Really? How did they resist?
Well, the people of Chu routinely ignored Qin's stringent moral and legal codes whenever the administrators weren't looking. They clung to their local customs, their music, their spiritual rites. They didn't just passively assimilate, they engaged in a massive, quiet campaign of civil disobedience.
But the disobedience couldn't save them from the corvée, right? The forced labor drafts. The first emperor, Ying Zheng, decides he needs to connect the northern defensive walls to keep the steppe nomads out. He begins building the precursor to the Great Wall of China. And who does he use for labor? the conquered Southerners.
The mechanism of cruelty here is just staggering. The Qin government forcibly conscripted hundreds of thousands of men from the humid, warm climate of Chu, marched them thousands of miles north to the arid, freezing steppes, and forced them to break rocks until they died of exposure, starvation, or exhaustion.
The trauma that inflicts on a society is unimaginable. Entire villages in the south just emptied of their fathers, brothers, and sons, sent to die for an emperor who completely despised their culture.
It's horrific.
The sources record these mournful folk poems from the era written by the families left behind, capturing this profound, hollow grief that eventually hardens into a white-hot rage.
And that rage catalyzed into a famous expression that circulated wildly in the South. A prophecy, really. Is that though Chu has but 3 clans, Qin shall fall by Chu's hand.
The universe loves a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the first emperor dies. And almost immediately, his iron-fisted legalist system, which was entirely dependent on his personal, terrifying presence, begins to fracture. And where does the very first spark of violent rebellion come from?
It comes from Chu. In 209 BC, a humble Chu peasant named Chen Sheng is leading a group of conscripts through a terrible rainstorm.
Okay.
Because of the flooding, they are going to be late reporting for their military duties. Under Qin's uncompromising legalist code, the punishment for being late is execution.
So Chen Shang does the math. He's like, if we go, we die. If we rebel, we die. We might as well die trying to overthrow the empire.
Exactly. He starts the Zhexiang uprising and proudly declares himself the king of rising Chu. Now, Chen Sheng's specific rebellion is eventually crushed by the remaining Qin military. But the psychological mechanism had been triggered. He proved the Qin armor could be pierced. The spark hit the powder keg, and the entire empire erupted into civil war.
The dominoes fall violently. And out of that chaos, 2 major warlords emerge to fight for control of the burning empire. Both of them, remarkably, are tied to the south. You have Zheng Yu, a terrifyingly brutal nobleman from the old Chu royal military families, and you have Liu Bang, a cunning, pragmatic rebel who originated from the Chu cultural sphere as a minor official.
They fight a devastating conflict known as the Chu-Han contention. And ultimately, it is Liu Bang, the man with deep roots in Chu culture, who emerges victorious. He founds the Han Dynasty, one of the greatest and most enduring empires in human history.
I want to look at a grand paradox here. We always operate on the cliche that, history is written by the victors.
Right.
Qin achieved the ultimate military victory. They literally wiped the state of Chu off the map and enslaved its people. But Liu Bang, when he builds the Han Dynasty, doesn't just recreate the brutal Qin machine.
No, he doesn't.
The sources indicate he actively blends the centralized governance of Qin with the poetry, the art, and the aesthetic soul of his native Chu.
That is the ultimate synthesis of this entire era. Qin won the War of Unification because their rigid legalism was the perfect mechanism for total war. But it was an abysmal mechanism for total peace.
Right.
You cannot govern an empire for centuries solely through the threat of execution and forced labor. The human spirit eventually violently snaps back.
So in a strange way, did Chu actually win the cultural war?
I would argue they did. The Han Dynasty endured for over 400 years, precisely because Liu Bang recognized that you need the structural skeleton of Qin's bureaucracy, but you must clothe it in the cultural flesh of Chu. The mysticism, the art, the softer philosophical edges of the South were integrated into the imperial identity. The culture of the defeated became the bedrock of what we now consider classical Chinese civilization.
To pull all of this together, we started this deep dive in an era where warfare was a chariot-riding ritual for the elite. We watched as the central authority collapsed and states cannibalized themselves in the pursuit of power.
Yeah, we saw the mechanics of warfare evolve into a mass infantry meat grinder fueled by iron and crossbows.
We traced the brutal pragmatism of the era through the wandering scholars. Men like Master Wu, who understood that rivers and mountains dictate human psychology.
And we saw the logistical genius of Sima Kuo, who realized that conquering the high ground of Shu was the geographic key to dominating the continent.
We witnessed the slow, agonizing fall of the massive state of Chu, outmaneuvered by the psychological brilliance and the feigned greed of Wang Zhen's rope-a-dope strategy.
Definitely.
And finally, we saw the incredible resilience of a conquered people who endured the trauma of the Great Wall only to rise up, fulfill a prophecy, and inject their cultural DNA into the empire that replaced their conquerors.
It leaves us with a profound realization about the mechanics of power. The sheer size and natural wealth of a state like Chu are entirely useless if the internal administration is corrupt and unwieldy.
Right.
But on the flip side, The hyper-efficiency and militaristic ruthlessness of a state like Cume is inherently self-destructive if it attempts to completely crush the humanity of the people it governs.
It is an incredibly delicate, terrifying balance.
It is. And to take that a step further, I keep returning to Master Wu's central philosophy. His entire worldview was predicated on the idea that the physical environment, the rugged mountains, the vast swamps, the flat plains, literally hardwires the psychological and political nature of a
The
society.
dirt creates the destiny.
Yeah. So here's a final thought for you, learner, to mull over as you look at our world today. We like to think that the internet, global trade, and modern technology have freed us from the constraints of our physical environment.
Right, we're all connected now.
Exactly. But if Master Wu was right, and geography truly dictates the deepest mechanics of our culture and our conflicts, how much of our modern political divide is still secretly being governed by the mountains, rivers, and plains we live on? Are we actually making free choices, or are we just acting out ancient geographic scripts on a 21st century map?
That is a staggering question to leave on. Are our modern borders and cultural wars just the ghosts of geography asserting themselves? We will leave you to ponder that. To the learner out there, we hope this deep dive into the mechanisms of the warring states gave you a few of those aha moments. Keep questioning the invisible structures around you, keep pulling the threads in your sources, and we will catch you next time.